The tribunal hall buzzed with low murmurs until Maya entered her presence, cut through the noise like a blade she wore. Civilian clothes, but carried the posture of someone trained to kill. Every movement she made was deliberate, practiced quiet, not to go unnoticed, but to make those watching unsure whether to look away or keep staring. She walked with a certainty that was unsettling. Her boots tapped against the polished floor in a slow rhythm that clashed with the rushed whispers and shifting bodies in the room, a room filled with officers and commanders, all pretending they did not already know who she was. She moved past rows of uniformed men and women, who turned their heads as she passed, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, caution, and in some cases fear. They had heard stories, most of them only half-believed stories, about missions that went unnamed, casualties that were never reported, targets that simply vanished from the map, and always at the center of those stories was a unit codenamed Cerberus, and at the center of Cerberus was Maya, though her real name was only spoken in locked rooms behind locked doors. She came to a stop before the tribunal. A long table draped in military green. Behind it sat the people who held power in this place, but none of them looked comfortable today. The man in the center, the commanding officer, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read from a file in front of him, though he already knew what was in it. The folder was just a prop, something to do with his hands while he tried to decide whether to treat Maya as an ally or a threat. Maya did not look at the folder. She did not look at the man. She looked past them all to a point in the room that seemed empty, but was in fact where the audio recording device sat hidden behind the wood paneling. She wanted them to know she understood everything that was happening here. She wanted the silence before the storm to last just a moment longer. The commanding officer cleared his throat and the room quieted further until even the air felt still. He glanced to his left, then to his right, then he fixed his gaze on Maya. His voice was steady but forced a low, controlled tone that could not quite hide the unease underneath. He said, "Maya, you are here under Article 19 Directive 6. You are to answer questions about your former assignment and submit to visual verification of unit status." He paused, then added, as if it were a small matter, "You will need to show your left arm." She said nothing at first, only blinked slowly once, her eyes like cold steel behind glass. Her left hand moved slightly toward her right sleeve, but stopped halfway. Not yet. Instead, she looked at the man and said, "You called me out of hiding." For this, her voice was quiet, but it carried, and the weight of it seemed to press down on everyone in the room. One of the younger officers sitting near the back visibly swallowed hard. "You will comply," the officer repeated, but he did not raise his voice, and he did not look her in the eyes. She could have laughed if she were the same person from 3 years ago, but she was not. She had seen too much, lost too much, and buried too many ghosts to find any humor here. Instead, she nodded just once, and the motion was so slight some missed it entirely. She reached for her sleeve and began to pull it up slowly with purpose, revealing skin marked not only by ink but by scars, the kind no training or rank could explain, the kind that made soldiers flinch when they saw them. The room began to shift, the air changed again, and before the tattoo was even visible, all the noise had stopped, and silence fell like a blade. A tall officer called her forward, his voice steady, but his hands betrayed a tremble. Maya moved with quiet force, each step echoing like a countdown. As all eyes fixed on her left arm, her boots struck the floor with the same slow rhythm as before. But now each step seemed louder, more deliberate, and the weight in the room grew heavier with each movement she made. The officer stood behind the tribunal table, his uniform perfectly pressed, his medals shining under the harsh lights, but his eyes kept flicking downward and his fingers clutched the edge of the table like he was bracing for impact. Maya stopped a few feet from him, close enough to make him shift his stance back, ever so slightly, and when she did not speak or offer any kind of salute, the silence between them stretched into something uncomfortable. The tribunal had dealt with soldiers before, even dangerous ones, but Maya was different. Her file had the usual redactions, but those who knew how to read between lines understood that Maya was not a soldier. She was a weapon designed for missions that were not meant to be remembered, and no one wanted to be the one to order a weapon to AC. He cleared his throat again, and the sound seemed too loud in the stillness. He motioned toward her left arm, his voice softer now, but still holding authority. "Show us your arm now," he said, and for a moment it was as if the words themselves refused to move through the air. Maya tilted her head slightly, watching him, her expression unreadable. Her body language relaxed, but her eyes were calculating, measuring every breath in the room, every muscle twitch, every flick of the eye. She knew the game being played here, and she also knew she was the one setting the rules, whether they admitted it or not. She raised her left hand slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of her sleeve, but instead of revealing the tattoo, right away she let the moment linger. Her eyes shifted to the people seated behind the officer, the tribunal members who were pretending to be neutral observers, though she could see fear and familiarity in their expressions. One of them, a woman in navy blue, tried to hold her gaze, but failed her eyes. Dropping like a guilty verdict, the officer repeated his command, but his voice cracked slightly this time, just enough to expose the truth beneath the uniform. Maya said nothing, and instead pulled the sleeve up slowly, the fabric sliding over her skin in near silence, until it stopped just below her elbow. A long scar, jagged and pale, then the Ink the Cerberus tattoo came into view, head by head fangs. Bared, snarling eyes glaring outward, the creature coiled in an eternal snarl wrapped around itself like a curse, 3 heads each, facing a different direction. Past, present, and what comes next, gasps echoed softly around the room. Not dramatic, but real enough to mark the shift in atmosphere. One of the tribunal members, a man with silver hair, leaned back in his chair, as though putting more distance between himself and what the ink represented, and Maya still said nothing. The officer swallowed hard and dropped his gaze, unable to look at the mark he had asked for. Behind him, whispers began to stir, questions without words, guilt without voice. Some had thought the tattoo was a myth, a story whispered by survivors of black site missions, by former operatives who vanished in the desert or behind enemy lines, but here it was drawn in perfect black and red. Proof that Cerberus was not only real, but standing in front of them. Maya let her arm remain uncovered, not out of defiance, but because the silence it caused was louder than any explanation she could offer, and louder than any order they dared to give. The commanding officer looked down at his notes, but it was clear he was not reading anymore. His mind was racing to find a way out of the trap. They had walked into. The tattoo was more than a mark. It was a challenge, a reminder that Maya was not just a ghost from their past, but a living reckoning. He cleared his throat again and tried to regain control. The room had turned into a cage filled with tension so thick it pressed against everyone like a storm waiting to break. Maya's calm presence was unsettling, the kind of calm that comes from having stared death in the face and knowing it did not win. You know why you're here, he said, his voice low this time, with less authority and more caution. You are to answer questions about your past, operations, your affiliations, and the truth behind the Cerberus. Maya nodded slowly, her eyes steady, unwavering. You want truth, she said, quietly, but there are truths that kill and lies that protect, and sometimes the two are the same. There was a murmur from the back of the room. A young officer whispered under his breath, but it was quickly silenced by a sharp look from the presiding general, who sat rigid and white-knuckled, as though holding on to the last fragments of control. The commanding officer leaned forward, his fingers tapping on the table, a rapid staccato against the polished wood. Maya watched the rhythm carefully. It was a sign of impatience or fear. She could not be sure. You will start by explaining why you disappeared after the last mission. Everyone believed you dead, your records erased, and your existence denied. Do you have any proof of survival? Maya lifted her arm. Slightly so, the tattoo caught the light. It was as if the ink itself was alive. The snarling Cerberus seemed to grow sharper, deeper, more threatening, a living testament to secrets that had been buried. To proof, she said, her voice calm but filled with a weight that made the room hold its breath. Proof is in the scars on my skin, the missions I survived, and the enemies I outlived. One of the tribunal members, a woman with tightly pulled back hair, raised a hand, her voice hesitant but demanding answers. What happened to the Cerberus unit? We were told it was disbanded after an incident. Eyes flicked to the woman. A flash of something unreadable passed over her face, but she answered without hesitation. The Cerberus unit was never disbanded. It was wiped off the map because it was dangerous, not just to the enemy, but to the people. Who sent us? A ripple of shock passed through the room, and someone gasped. Maya continued. The missions we carried out were black ops, missions beyond oversight, missions that meant to be invisible and expendable when the truth came too close to exposing what was really happening. She paused and looked around the room, her gaze locking onto the commanding officer, now visibly sweating, the weight of her words sinking in this was not just about her anymore, it was about the lies and betrayals hidden beneath layers of silence. I came back, because I needed to remind you all that Cerberus did not vanish because we failed, but because you feared the truth we uncovered and the power we wielded. The tribunal remained silent, the only sound the ticking of a clock somewhere distant, but to Maya it was the countdown to a reckoning she had already prepared for. Maya's sleeve was still rolled up, revealing the Cerberus tattoo as the eyes in the tribunal shifted. She could feel their fear like a wave rolling through the room, the kind of fear that comes from knowing something dark has been uncovered. The commanding officer swallowed hard and tried to regain his composure, his fingers drumming nervously on the table, but Maya saw through it. She had read men like this before, men who thought control was a shield but were blind to the cracks forming beneath their feet. Speak of power and fear, Maya said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife, but power without accountability is nothing more than a weapon waiting to turn on its wielder. The truth we uncovered was dangerous. Rose from the gallery, a few officers exchanged glances, some leaning closer to hear what Maya would say next. The tension was palpable, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next revelation. One of the tribunal members, a stern-faced colonel, adjusted his glasses and asked, "Did the Cerberus unit go rogue? Were you acting under orders or on your own authority?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Maya met his gaze steadily. "I never went rogue. The orders came from Shadows, orders that came with no names, no signatures, only consequences, orders designed to make us invisible to the world and expendable to those who sent us. We carried out those missions because someone had to, but when the missions crossed lines that could not be ignored, we stopped answering to shadows and started answering to the truth." There was a shift in the room, a subtle change, as if some invisible barrier had been broken. The commanding officer frowned, his jaw clenched, and for the first time his voice faltered. "You speak as if you chose to defy direct commands, and that is insubordination, punishable by court-martial." Maya's eyes flashed with something fierce and unyielding. "I chose to survive and to speak because silence kills, and truth is the only way to heal wounds that fester in darkness. If that makes me a rebel, then so be it." The general at the head of the tribunal leaned forward, his face pale and drawn. The tattoo had unsettled him deeply, and Maya could see the lines of guilt and fear etched in his expression. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he simply nodded toward the aide, who quietly closed the folder marked Cerberus. The aide moved to leave the room. Maya lowered her sleeve, slowly letting the tattoo disappear beneath the fabric, but the silence that followed was louder than any words. The room, her steps echoing in the hollow chamber, her message sent clear and undeniable. The past was not dead and buried, and neither was she. The room remained still, long after Maya's sleeve had fallen back into place. The Cerberus tattoo hidden once more, but its presence lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The officers and tribunal members exchanged glances laden with unspoken questions and fears, as if they had glimpsed a truth that could not be undone. Whispers began to rise softly from the back rows, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd, some faces pale, others hardened with resolve, but all touched by the weight of what Maya had revealed. The younger officers looked on with wide eyes, as if a legend had stepped out of the shadows and into the light. One man stood abruptly, a colonel whose name Maya recognized from past missions. He cleared his throat, and his voice cracked slightly as he addressed the room with a tone part accusation, part disbelief. "How many of us have been walking blind all this time?" he asked. "How many more secrets are buried beneath layers of deception, waiting to explode?" Maya's gaze locked onto him, steady, unwavering. "I am not the only one," she said softly. "The Cerberus unit was never just a handful of soldiers. We were a network, a shadow army that operated beyond reach and oversight. Some of us disappeared, some were silenced, but others survived, and we are still watching." The room grew colder, as if the very air had been drained of warmth and safety. The commanding officer rubbed his temples, his mind racing to contain the chaos, his authority challenged in ways he never anticipated. But Maya was relentless, her presence a constant reminder of the past that refused to stay buried. A woman in the front row, a lieutenant who had remained silent until now, spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. "I want to know what happened on those missions. What truths were so dangerous that they had to be erased from history? Why was Cerberus marked for death?" Maya looked at her, and saw in her eyes the same hunger for answers that had driven her to return here. She took a slow breath and began to recount the stories that had been locked away. The Black Ops missions that involved disappearances, sabotage, and cover-ups. Missions that revealed corruption at the highest levels, and enemies that wore the faces of friends. Maya spoke. The room fell deeper into silence, her words painting pictures of betrayal and sacrifice of comrades lost in promises. Broken, her voice never wavering, even as the weight of each memory settled on the listeners like a heavy fog. The commanding officer finally spoke, breaking the spell, his voice low and edged with anger. These stories threaten the very foundation of our command, and if they are true, the consequences will be catastrophic for everyone involved. Maya met his gaze without fear. Then let the consequences come, she said firmly, because the truth deserves to be heard, and justice deserves a chance, even if it means dismantling the lies built on fear. The tribunal chamber felt like a battlefield now. The war was no longer just one fought with guns and covert operations, but a battle for truth and survival within walls that had long protected secrets. Maya's presence was a challenge. A spark igniting a fight that could not be silenced by orders or threats, and as she stood there, the room realized that Cerberus was not a name to fear, but a force that demanded reckoning. The room remained heavy with silence, after Maya's words hung in the air like a challenge no one wanted to accept yet. None could ignore a sense of unease settled over the tribunal, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The commanding officer clenched his fists beneath the table, his knuckles whitening, but his face showed none of the fury that burned inside. Instead, he chose restraint as his weapon. One of the senior officers, a man with silver hair and a face carved by years of battle, rose slowly from his chair, his voice calm but laced with authority. "We are here to seek the truth," he said. "We cannot let old ghosts cloud our judgment or undo the order that holds this command together." Maya turned her gaze to him, steady and unwavering. "I am not here to unravel your order, but to expose the fractures it hides. The ghosts you fear are the truth you refuse to face, because if you do, the foundation you stand on will crumble." Murmurs rippled through the chamber, some voices rising in support, others whispering doubts. The senior officer frowned and shook his head. This was not what he had expected. A trial was supposed to be a formality, a cleansing ritual, not a battlefield where wounds reopened and secrets threatened to explode. He motioned toward the aide, who brought a small leather case and placed it on the table. The commanding officer opened it, revealing a series of photos, grainy images from a past mission, some marked with timestamps, others with coordinates. The tribunal members leaned in to examine them carefully. The photos showed shadows moving in hostile terrain, but the faces were blurred or obscured, leaving more questions than answers. Maya studied the photos, her eyes sharp and calculating. The mission in the images was one of many that Cerberus carried out, she said softly, but these images tell only part of the story. The truth lies in what they do not show, the orders given, the lies fed to us, the comrades left behind. The commanding officer's voice was strained as he spoke again. "There are allegations that Cerberus acted outside the law, that collateral damage was ignored, and that innocent lives were lost. The tribunal must determine if you are responsible for war crimes or if you are a victim of circumstance." Maya's jaw tightened and her eyes flashed with anger. "I am responsible for every choice I made, but those who hid behind false reports and clean records are responsible for far worse. The truth does not protect the guilty, it exposes them." The senior officer sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "This tribunal is no longer just a hearing. It is a reckoning, a test of loyalty and courage in the face of a truth that threatens to unravel the very fabric of command." A young officer in the back stood up, his voice breaking the tension with a question. "What happens if the truth destroys everything we built? What happens if Cerberus was right and we were wrong all along?" Maya looked at him and smiled faintly. "Not everything built on lies can stand," she said quietly, "but out of destruction comes the chance to rebuild stronger, to face the future without fear or shadows." The commanding officer finally nodded and called the tribunal to order. The next phase of questioning would begin. The room braced for what was to come, knowing the battle for truth had only just begun, and that Maya was the key to unlocking a past no one wanted to face, but everyone needed to understand. Maya stood tall in the center of the tribunal chamber, her left arm Still bare beneath the rolled sleeve, the Cerberus tattoo, a silent witness to the battles. Fought in shadows, and the secrets long buried the faces around her were a mix of suspicion, doubt, and something deeper. Fear, the fear of a past returning to claim its duchy. Took a slow breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the room resting on her like 1,000 unspoken questions pressing down. Or show weakness, the calm she radiated was not peace, but the readiness of someone who had faced hell and returned. The commanding officer spoke first, his tone sharper now, the veneer of control slipping away. "You speak of loyalty, Maya, but what about betrayal? What about the comrades lost because you defied orders and the consequences of your actions?" Maya's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained steady. "The real betrayal was not mine. It was the lies told to us, the promises broken, and the silence enforced to cover the truth. I did what had to be done to survive and to protect those who could not protect themselves." The murmur of agreement and dissent rippled through the tribunal, some nodding quietly, others shaking their heads, unwilling to accept her defiance, but unable to deny the conviction in her words. One of the younger officers leaned forward, her voice trembling but earnest. "Why now, Maya? Why come back after all this time? What do you want from us?" Maya looked at her and smiled. "Faintly, because the truth cannot stay hidden forever," she said softly. "The past is not dead. It lives inside us, in scars, in memories, in the stories we refuse to tell, but they shape us and they demand reckoning." The commanding officer slammed his fist lightly on the table, his patience worn thin. "You want to dismantle everything we have built, to reopen wounds that have barely healed. Is that justice or revenge?" Maya stepped closer to the table, her eyes blazing with fierce clarity. "Justice," she said. "Simply, justice means facing the consequences, not hiding behind walls of silence and lies. It means giving voice to the forgotten and holding accountable those who thought they were untouchable." The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears, and the realization that this was no longer just a tribunal, but a turning point, a moment where history and future collided in fragile balance. She lowered her arms slowly, the tattoo disappearing beneath the fabric, but its mark remained etched in the minds of everyone. Present a symbol of resilience and rebellion, a challenge to the order they had all served so quietly for so long. The presiding general finally spoke, his voice heavy with weariness. "This will not be easy, Maya, but the truth must come out for the sake of those lost and those still fighting." Maya nodded, her resolve unshaken. "The fight is not over, General, it has only just begun, and Cerberus is here to see it through." The tribunal chamber was heavy with tension. As the final session began, Maya stood firm, her presence commanding even in silence, the Cerberus tattoo hidden beneath her sleeve. Yet its power felt alive in the room, like a heartbeat echoing through. The walls, the officers and commanders faced a reckoning. They could not avoid the truth they had long feared was now unveiled, and it demanded answers. The commanding officer took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice, his authority challenged, but not yet broken. "We will proceed with the final testimonies," he said. The room waited expectantly, knowing this was the moment when stories long buried would surface and lives would be changed forever. Maya stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with a fierce determination. "I will tell you everything about Cerberus, about the missions we carried out, the orders we followed, and the price we paid for loyalty to shadows." Instead of light, she paused, letting the weight of her words settle on the room like a heavy fog. The tribunal members leaned in, their eyes fixed on her as she began to unravel the story of betrayal and sacrifice of comrades, lost to secrets and lies of a unit that became both weapon and victim of a system that feared its own creation. She spoke of the silent wars, fought in deserts and jungles, of missions erased from history, and of the scars that would never heal. Questions came fast and sharp, but Maya answered each with clarity and courage. The room was transformed from a place of judgment to a battlefield of truth, where every word was a weapon and every silence a wound that demanded healing. The commanding officer finally spoke, his voice low and weary. "Maya, your testimony forces us to confront a reality we denied for too long, but it also offers a chance for redemption, for those who suffered in silence, and for the system that must change." Maya nodded, her gaze steady and unwavering. "The past cannot be changed, but the future can be shaped, if we have the courage to face it together," she said, her words a promise and a challenge. The session closed. The room was silent, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of truth and the hope of reckoning. a reckoning that would redefine loyalty, justice, and honor in ways no one had dared imagine. Maya left the chamber, her steps echoing down the hall, not as a shadow, but as a beacon. The Cerberus tattoo, hidden yet impossible to forget, a symbol of resilience, rebellion, and the unyielding quest for truth in a world built on secrets. The tribunal would never be the same, and neither would the soldiers, who had witnessed the unveiling of a legend, the legend of Cerberus, a unit that refused to disappear, and a woman who dared to bring the past into the light.